Snoozecast, the podcast designed to help you fall asleep. Find us on snoozecast.com and follow us on Instagram @Snoozecast to find behind-the-scenes content. If you enjoy our show, please write a review on the Apple Podcasts app. Please know that we read and appreciate every single one. This episode is brought to you by our Patreon supporters and by Pigeons Cooing. Tonight, we'll read the next part to The Princess and the Goblin, a children's fantasy novel published in 1872. If you'd like an easy way to listen to these continuing episodes in order, go to snoozecast.com/series. When we left off, our little hero Curdie is trying to find his way out of the Goblin's cave system when he stumbles upon a strange sight. Let's get cozy. Close your eyes. Relax your body into the softness of your bed. Now, take a few deep breaths. Curdie came at length to a small chamber of the caverns in which an opening high in the wall revealed a glow beyond. To this opening he managed to scramble up, and then he saw a strange sight. Below sat a little group of goblins around a fire, the smoke of which vanished in the darkness far aloft. The sides of the cave were full of shining minerals like those of the palace hall, and the company was evidently of a superior order, for every one wore stones about head or waist or arms, shining dull, gorgeous colors in the light of the fire. Nor had Curdie looked long before he recognized the king himself and found that he had made his way into the inner apartment of the royal family. He had never had such a good chance of hearing something. He crept through the hole as softly as he could, scrambled a good way down the wall towards them without attracting attention, and then sat down and listened. The king, evidently the queen, and probably the crown prince and the prime minister were talking together. He was sure of the queen by her shoes, for as she warmed her feet at the fire, he saw them quite plainly. "That will be fun," said the one he took for the crown prince. It was the first whole sentence he heard. "I don't see why you should think it such a grand affair," said his stepmother, tossing her head backward. "You must remember, my spouse," interposed His Majesty, as if making excuse for his son. "He has got the same blood in him. His mother—" "Don't talk to me of his mother. You positively encourage his unnatural fancies. Whatever belongs to that mother ought to be removed. You forget yourself, my dear, said the king. I don't, said the queen. Nor you either. If you expect me to approve of such coarse tastes, you will find yourself mistaken. I don't wear shoes for nothing. You must acknowledge, however, the king said, with a little groan, that this at least is no whim of Rabbit's, but a matter of state policy. You are well aware that his gratification comes purely from the pleasure of sacrificing himself to the public good. Does it not, Rabbit? Yes, father, of course it does. Perhaps. Do you think I've got toes? Cried the queen, and she moved towards Rabbit angrily. The counselor, however, who was betwixt them, leaned forward so as to prevent her touching him, but only as if to address the prince. Your Royal Highness, he said, possibly requires to be reminded that you have got 3 toes yourself, 1 on one foot, 2 on the other. Ha ha ha, shouted the queen triumphantly. The counselor, encouraged by this mark of favor, went on. It seems to me, Your Royal Highness, it would be greatly endearing of you to your future people, proving to them that you are not the less one of themselves, that you had the misfortune to be born of a son-mother, if you were to command upon yourself the comparatively slight operation which, in a more extended form, you so wisely meditate with regard to your future princess. Ha ha ha, laughed the queen, louder than before, and the king and the minister joined in the laugh. Rabbit growled, and for a few moments the others continued to express their enjoyment of his discomfiture. The queen was the only one Curdie could see with any distinctness. She sat sideways to him, and the light of the fire shone full upon her face. He could not consider her handsome. Her nose was certainly broader at the end than its extreme length, and her eyes, instead of being horizontal, were set up like 2 perpendicular eggs, one on the broad, the other on the small end. Her mouth was no bigger than a small buttonhole until she laughed, when it stretched from ear to ear. Only, to be sure, her ears were very nearly in the middle of her cheeks. Wanting to hear everything they might say, Curdie ventured to slide down a smooth part of the rock just under him to a projection below, upon which he thought to rest. But whether he was not careful enough, or the projection gave way, down he came with a rush on the floor of the cavern, bringing with him a great rumbling shower of stones. The goblins jumped from their seats in more anger than consternation, for they had never yet seen anything to be afraid of in the palace. But when they saw Curdie with his pick in his hand, their rage was mingled with alarm, for they took him for the first of an invasion of miners. The king, notwithstanding, drew himself up to his full height of 4 feet, spread himself to his full breadth of 3.5, for he was the handsomest and squarest of all the goblins, and, strutting up to Curdie, planted himself with outspread feet before him, and said with dignity, "Pray, what right have you in my palace?" "The right of necessity, your majesty," answered Curdie. "I lost my way, and I did not know where I was wandering to." "How did you get in?" "By a hole in the mountain." "But you are a miner. Look at your pickaxe." Curdie did look at it, answering, "I came upon it lying on the ground a little way from here. I tumbled over some wild beasts who were playing with it. Look, your majesty." And Curdie showed him how he was scratched. The king was pleased to find him behave more politely than he had expected from what his people had told him concerning the miners, for he attributed it to the power of his own presence. But he did not, therefore, feel friendly to the intruder. "You will oblige me by walking out of my dominions at once," he said, well knowing what a mockery lay in the words. "With pleasure, if your majesty will give me a guide," said Curdie. "I will give you 1,000, said the king, with a scoffing air of magnificent liberality. "One will be quite sufficient," said Curdie. But the king uttered a strange shout, half halloo, half roar, and in rushed goblins till the cave was swarming. He said something to the first of them, which Curdie could not hear, and it was passed from one to another, till in a moment the farthest in the crowd had evidently heard and understood it. They began to gather about him, and he retreated towards the wall. They pressed him. "Stand back," said Curdie. They only pressed closer. Curdie bethought himself and began to rhyme. 10, 20, 30, you are all so very dirty. 20, 30, 40, you're all so thick and snorty. 30, 40, 50, you're all so puff and snifty. 40, 50, 60, beast and man so mixty. 50, 60, 70, mixty, maxty, leavendy. 60, 70, 80, all your cheeks so slaty? 70, 80, 90? All your hands so flinty? 80, 90, 100? Altogether dundred. The goblins fell back a little when he began, and made grimaces all through the rhyme, as if eating something disagreeable. But whether it was that the rhyming words were most of them no words at all, for a new rhyme being considered the more efficacious, Curdie had made it on the spur of the moment, or whether it was that the presence of the king and queen gave them courage, I cannot tell. But the moment the rhyme was over, they crowded on him again. Curdie, being as gentle as courageous, didn't want to use his pickaxe in defense. He remembered the vulnerable part of the goblin body. Curdie made a sudden rush at the king and stamped with all his might on his majesty's feet. The king gave a most unkingly howl and almost fell into the fire. Curdie then rushed into the crowd, stamping right and left. The goblins drew back, howling on every side as he approached, but they were so crowded that few of those he attacked could escape his tread. They were tumbling over each other in heaps in their eagerness to rush from the cave, when a new assailant suddenly faced him. The queen, with flaming eyes, her hair standing half up from her head. She trusted in her shoes. They were of granite, hollowed like French clogs. Curdie would have endured much rather than hurt a woman, even if she was a goblin. But here was a critical affair. Forgetting her shoes, he made a great stamp on one of her feet, which of course had no effect at all. His only chance with her would have been to swing at the granite shoes with his pickaxe. But before he could think of that, she had caught him up in her arms and was rushing with him across the cave. She dashed him into a hole in the wall. He heard a great cry and the rush of multitudes of soft feet, followed by the sounds of something heaved up against the rock. The last had not ceased when he grew faint. When he came to himself, there was perfect silence about him and utter darkness, but for the merest glimmer in one tiny spot. He crawled to it and found that they had heaved a slab against the mouth of the hole, past the edge of which a little gleam found its way from the fire. He could not move it, for they had piled a great heap of stones against it. He sat down and tried to think, but soon fell fast asleep. Chapter 19. Goblin Counsels. He must have slept a long time, for when he awoke, he felt wonderfully restored, indeed, almost well, and very hungry. There were voices in the outer cave. Once more then, it was night, for the goblins slept during the day and went about their affairs during the night. In the universal and constant darkness of their dwelling, they had no reason to prefer the one arrangement to the other, but from aversion to the Sun People, they chose to be busy when there was at least no chance of their being met either by the miners below when they were burrowing, or by the people of the mountain above. And, indeed, it was only when the sun was away that the outside of the mountain was sufficiently like their own dismal regions to be endurable to their mole-like eyes. Curdie listened and soon found that they were talking of himself. "How long will it take?" asked Rabbit. "Not many days, I should think," answered the king. "They are poor, feeble creatures, those Sun People, and want to be always eating. We can go a week at a time without food and be all the better for it. But I've been told they eat 2 or 3 times every day. Can you believe it?" "If I may be allowed a word," interposed the queen, "and I think I ought to have some voice in the matter." "The wretch is entirely at your disposal, my spouse," interrupted the king. "He is your property. You caught him yourself. We should never have done it." The queen laughed. She seemed in far better humor than the night before. She said, "Let us take him out and interrogate him." "You are the best of wives, my lovely queen," said her husband. "Let it be so by all means. Let us have our people in and get him out to talk. The mischief he might have brought upon us, now that he had penetrated so far as our most retired citadel, is incalculable." "Excellent," cried the queen and the prince together, both of them clapping their hands. "But," added the queen, bethinking herself, "he is so troublesome. For poor creatures as they are, there is something about those Sun People that is very troublesome. I cannot imagine how it is that with such superior strength and skill and understanding as ours, we permit them to exist at all. Why do we not destroy them and use their cattle and grazing lands at our pleasure? Of course, we don't want to live in their bright, horrid country. It is far too glaring for our quieter and more refined tastes. But we might use it as a sort of outhouse, you know. Even our creatures' eyes might get used to it. And if they did grow blind, that would be of no consequence, provided they grew fat as well. But we might even keep their great cows and other creatures, and then we should have a few more luxuries, such as cream and cheese, which at present we only taste occasionally when our brave men have succeeded in carrying some off from their farms. It is worth thinking of, said the king, and I don't know why you should be the first to suggest it, except that you have a positive genius for conquest. But still, as you say, there is something very troublesome about them, and it would be better, as I understand you to suggest, that we should let him sit in that hole for another day or two first, so that he may be a little less powerful and frisky when we take him out. Once there was a goblin living in a hole. Busy he was cobbling a shoe without a sole. By came a birdie. Goblin, what do you do? Cobble at a sturdy upper leather shoe. What's the good o' that, sir? Said the little bird. Why, it's very pat, sir, plain without a word. Where 'tis all a hole, sir, never can be holes. Why should their shoes have soles, sir, when they've got no soles? What's that horrible noise? Cried the queen, shuddering from pot metal head to granite shoes. I declare, said the king with solemn indignation, it's the sun creature in the hole. Stop that noise, cried the crown prince valiantly, getting up and standing in front of the heap of stones with his face towards Curdie's prison. Do now. Break away, shouted Curdie, and began rhyming again. Once there was a goblin living in a hole. I really cannot bear it, said the queen. If I could only get at his horrid toes with my slippers again. I think we had better go to bed, said the king. It's not time to go to bed, said the queen. I would if I was you, said Curdie. Impertinent wretch, said the queen, with the utmost scorn in her voice. An impossible if, said his majesty, with dignity. Quite, returned Curdie, and began singing again. Go to bed, goblin, do, help the queen take off her shoe. If you do, it will disclose a horrid set of sprouting toes. What a lie, roared the queen in a rage. By the way, that reminds me, said the king, that for as long as we've been married, I have never seen your feet, queen. I think you might take off your shoes when you go to bed. They positively hurt me sometimes. I will do as I like, retorted the queen. You ought to do, or at least think of what your hubby wishes too, said the king. I will not, said the queen. Then I must insist as the king. Apparently, His Majesty approached the queen for the purpose of following the advice given by Curdie, for the latter heard a scuffle and then a great roar from the king. Will you be quiet then? Said the queen. Yes, yes, queen. I only meant to coax you. Hands off, cried the queen triumphantly. I'm going to bed. You may come when you like. But as long as I am queen, I will sleep in my shoes. It is my royal privilege. Rabbit, go to bed. I'm going, said Rabbit, sleepily. So am I, said the king. Come along then, said the queen, and mind you are good. Curdie heard only the most supplicating of tones muttered from the king as a reply in the distance, and then the cave was quite still.